Hello, very beautiful community. It's a privilege to be with you. It's been a battle to be able to sit up and speak with you briefly for health reasons. So I want to get right into it. We're really going to have a main channel's worth of substance in what we say, but we're going to deliver it, if that's okay, in jumpy bullet points. We're going to start with more ephemeral reflections that a lot of you crave, but a lot of you are pissed off about because they don't feel concrete enough, just general remarks on the global order. Then we'll get more and more concrete and talk about Trump's deal making with Ukraine and Russia. So, just going to be probably sort of 8-12 remarks about where we are in the world, with the ground shifting under our feet a little bit. And by the way, yes, it is okay to be physiologically shocked by this, and it's going to take 18-24 months, if you are very shocked, to align yourself with a sufficient acceptance of where the world's going. Now, the structural causes of the war, forgive me for a couple of very general remarks, haven't gone away. The full-scale war in 2022. That's to say, Putin didn't break the global order when he invaded Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine because the global order was broken, but it's more broken now than it was in 2022. So many of the structural factors that contributed to the war haven't gone, they have deteriorated since then, putting us even into an even more unstable world. Second point, there's a global wave of authoritarianism that can be ideologically captured with a tag like hyper-neoliberalism. Now, if you look at what Trump is doing, it contains elements of might is right, elements of neoliberalism, a kind of a magical primacy being put on the market, and elements of neoconservatism, actually, for all of the talk against neoconservatism. In many ways, Trump's reckless interventionism is not actually ideologically disconnected from the neocon story, even though the neocon story is being rejected on the surface, which is quite interesting. Just like we can be consciously denying something, but actually subconsciously acting in accordance with it, so the same can happen with ideology. You can be acting in accordance with an ideology while consciously rejecting the ideology. Now, the reason I call it hyper-neoliberalism, if you put all of these elements together, is because neoliberalism is just a thoughtless emphasis on the market. Hyper-neoliberalism is a thoughtless emphasis on the market and then a reconceptualization of the market as just unbounded conflict between human beings, a conflict of all against all as a version of normal with the strongest prevailing. Now that's a feature of both Trump's ideology and Putin's. Putin's ideology has 3 pillars. That's one of them, and he shares that with Trump. The mystical pillar he doesn't share with Trump, and the fascist pillar he doesn't quite share with Trump. We'll talk about that more in a separate video when health allows on the ideology of Putinism. But the next video on the main channel will be about Trump's narcissistic submissiveness to Putin. It'll come health allowing, beautiful community. So we're moving into a world of hard power and frenemies. I mean, hard power has always mattered, but the balance is tilting away from soft to hard power, even in context where up until now, for a couple of decades, soft power had prevailed. We're moving into a world of action by great powers and medium powers, unrestrained by international law and international norms, and we're moving into a world of frenemies, into a world of enemies and friends in certain respects. So the global reality is a carousel of relationships that often simultaneously combine enemy and friendship relations in different dimensions between two countries. Now, a bigger question arises, and I promise you this is going to be the last really abstract point we make. Is it at all possible now for societies that are free, that have a modicum of equality, and that are tethered to a degree to truthfulness, to survive at all? Or are we out of a bubble and in a new world in which opacity in the way societies are run and authoritarianism are the default? Does that have to be true? And the answer is no. But it's not an obvious no, right? It's a no that it's going to take a lot of work on our part and also a lot of luck on our part to consolidate as a no. And that's about hope, because you can be hopeful, as that is actually possible in my view in the near term to sustain such societies. But it's harder and it's not obviously possible, it's just possible. Now, liberal elites and certainly many of the technocratic centrist political figures in the West are lost. They are in a position somewhat akin to, let's say, and I gave this analogy the other day, an orchestra that is trying to play in a world in which musical instruments haven't been invented. It's a kind of a complete epistemic incapacitation. And what's interesting is that in the few retreats in which you still find liberal strongholds in society, in parts of the media, in the academy, you have a clear pattern of institutional weakness. So liberalism is at a loss epistemically and in retreat. An important point about Trump's domestic politics. Trump is equating, and his people are equating, the Trumpian project with the US national project, which is to say, other proposals for US national projects for them aren't proposals for US national projects. They're un-American, they're foreign. They're alien attacks on America. And that's a fundamental obliteration of the relation of friend, of ally and opponent, the conversion of that into ally and enemy. Now notice how the Trumpians regard other proposals for America, not that there are many coherent ones, but at least in principle, as being un-American. Trump speaks about the Democrats like they were a foreign country. Trump doesn't speak about things that were done under the Biden administration as though his country did them. That's not his country that did them, that's another country. Even though he was the president of the country that did them. Even if it wasn't quite the case that he was the president at that particular time. So that's extremely dangerous, right? When your opponents become a foreign country and indeed an external enemy. This obliterates a basic distinction between result and process. In a democracy, you're supposed to debate the result, but accept the process that's generated the result. But Trump is saying, unless we have the right result, we're not going to accept the process. relations, right? So this is a lapse into a politics of enemies. Let's talk about deal making. Now, the US position, Ukraine and Russia deal making. Now, the US position has changed. Under Biden, the position was that the US was behind the Ukrainian survival, but not Ukrainian victory. Now, the US is behind Ukrainian survival, depending on various contingencies and depending on whether they feel that that serves American interests, right? So the unconditional commitment to Ukrainian survival has now become very conditional indeed. Putin's position, I mean, Putin's aspiration remains the dissolution of NATO, which he's already partly got, and essentially the desire to clear NATO according to the ultimatum he gave pre-full-scale war out of Eastern Europe, at least to some significant degree. That remains Putin's sort of wider aspiration beyond political control over Ukraine. How is Putin thinking about the negotiation with Trump? I've made quite a few videos about this, including on the main channel, and my position is the same. In other words, I'm confident enough in a kind of an interpretation that says Putin hasn't decided. That's to say, I'm claiming that Putin is genuinely open to a deal, but his default is to negotiate without negotiating, right? To participate in the negotiations without wanting a sustainable result, unless he gets a favorable deal. And a favorable deal is a deal that does one of two things, or two things indeed. One is it puts Ukraine in a more toxic position than Ukraine would be without that deal, and it rearranges global affairs such that Putin can say, well, we've had some kind of propulsion of Russia forward from the back row to the front row of nations. There's a collective international pull to evict Zelensky. Putin wants to evict Zelensky in part for non-tactical reasons. He sees Zelensky as somebody who betrayed him, and Putin's gangsterish principles of procedure are what make him, the ethics of these gangsterish principles of procedure are what make him feel that Zelensky needs to be got out. So if you told Putin tomorrow, well, we're going to have Zelensky, and actually it'll make Ukraine stronger and even harder for you to deal with, Putin would say, absolutely, let's have that. So he is committed to getting rid of Zelensky, whether it serves him or not, because Zelensky has violated, if you like, Putin's sort of might is right, but there are a few gangsterish principles in the world kind of approach to international politics. Therefore, he sees Zelensky as a traitor, not an enemy. Meanwhile, Trump has, and this is really a comment about the power of individuals in history, you see Putin and Trump. Trump also has visceral personal distaste towards Zelensky, and you can see it. And I provoked a few people the other day by saying that Trump despises Zelensky for being short, for his raspy voice. He conceives of Zelensky as something sort of off the street, something homeless, unhygienic. You can see where I'm going with this a little bit also. There wouldn't... Trump's anti-Semitic dispositions are contingent. They can actually be turned off or turned on depending on the context. But Zelensky is in this sandwich where the tyrant in the Kremlin has a personal issue with him that is more important actually than tactical moves for Russia's advantage. And the US president also despises Zelensky. It's a very difficult position in which to be. Now, a brief remark on the amateurishness of some of Trump's team. I mean, these are really people who don't know Ukraine or Russia. And they're liable to make various kinds of mistakes. For instance, underestimate the dependence of the Russian economy on China, and have various kinds of naive thoughts about peeling Russia away from China. And also possibly have naive thoughts about putting pressure on Russia via greater sanctions, but you can't do much that way short term, as Janis Kluger has been powerfully arguing recently. About the resource deal, I'd advise a degree of skepticism because there's a lot of post-truth to it. There's a lot of Trump being attracted to a wrapper without much evidence so far of what the concrete agency-derived business plan is, what is going to happen, how, and by what mechanisms, such that the United States could be advantaged. So wait for more on this and allow a degree of sort of post-truth emphasis of surfaces there. So apply that degree of skepticism for now. Final remark, there's a new paradox appearing for Putin, and that's that Putin needs escalation and arguably war for regime security. Regime security is the central motive for Putin's war, and it's one of the two categories of motive. The other is this sort of desire to fulfill an historical mission and realign Russia's place in the world by somehow propelling it forward in a sort of rapid zigzag move from a backward to an advanced position. But if Putin is given so many concessions and so many opportunities for reintegration, including the dissolution of Article 5, then a problem arises. There isn't a West for him anymore to escalate against. And yet, it's that escalation that's needed to concentrate regime security at home. So that's a new paradox that we shouldn't overestimate, but is at least at risk of arising for Putin. Now, I'm going to stretch this and make an exaggeration that you should understand is very much an exaggeration, but that's that there is a small and very historically ironic chance that the Putin regime could collapse because of Trump's, in many ways, unqualified submission to Putin, because Putin is dependent on a large and persistent conflict with the West for regime security at home. And one of Putin's moves would then have to be to try to start a much more definitive war on enemies inside Russia. Now, understand that what I've just said is an exaggeration, but it is now a paradox that's arising, that Putin's regime security could be jeopardized by the extent of Western submission to him because he's dependent on a conflict with us. Thank you for tolerating this set of bullet points, and it's lovely to have been with you. And we're going to be talking soon again. Lots and lots and lots of love.